Germany had not finished falling when Eisenhower told Patton to stop. The order came through command channels, formal and precise, dressed in the language of strategy and Allied coordination. But Patton had eyes on the road ahead. His armor was moving, his men were moving, and somewhere beyond the current line, past the hesitation, past the political calculations being made in rooms far from the mud and wreckage, the war still had answers it had not yet given up. So Patton stopped. On paper. What no order could stop was the question forming behind his eyes: if the enemy was breaking, if the road was open, if American boys were still unaccounted for in the East, then what exactly were they slowing down for? By the spring of 1945, the shape of Europe was changing faster than any map could record. German resistance, though still violent in pockets, was fracturing along every axis. Entire army groups were surrendering. Cities that had held for years were falling in days. The Reich, which had consumed a continent, was consuming itself in its final weeks, and the men of the Third Army, Patton's army, were among the fastest-moving forces on any front. They had crossed the Rhine. They had punched through central Germany. They were, by any tactical measure, ahead of schedule, ahead of every prediction, and ahead of the plan. That last point was where the tension lived. Patton had been a problem for Allied command before. His speed during the breakout from Normandy had startled his own supply chain. His impatience with caution was well documented, not only in the field, but in the cables and communiques that moved between generals and governments. He was effective in a way that made people uncomfortable, because his effectiveness kept producing situations that politics had not prepared for. When your fastest general reaches a position before diplomats have decided what should happen there, the general becomes the problem, not the enemy. By early April, Patton's forces were pushing into territory that carried enormous strategic weight, not just militarily, but politically. The Soviets were advancing from the east, the Western Allies were advancing from the west, and somewhere in the middle, the agreements made at Yalta months earlier were beginning to define not just what territory armies could take, but what territory they were permitted to keep. Eisenhower, as Supreme Allied Commander, was navigating a coalition war. He needed Patton's speed. He also needed Patton contained, and on more than one occasion, the order came down to slow down, to halt, to hold the line and wait. The reasons given were logistical. The reasons underneath were something else entirely. The official explanation for the halt orders made sense on the surface. Supply lines were stretched. Coordination with other Allied forces required alignment. The Soviets needed time to reach their agreed-upon positions. The political framework established at Yalta had drawn boundaries not just for post-war occupation, but for the final movements of the war itself. Western forces advancing too deeply into what had been designated Soviet territory risked fracturing the alliance at the moment it was supposed to be completing its victory. Eisenhower understood this. Washington understood this. The logic was real. Patton understood it. He simply did not agree with it. His objection was not purely tactical, though he always framed his impatience in tactical language. It was something closer to a moral and strategic instinct that went beyond the immediate battlefield. Patton had been watching how the war was ending, not just where the front lines moved, but what was being left behind, what was being traded away, what was being handed over in the name of Allied harmony. He had seen the maps. He understood what it meant when Western forces halted short of Prague, short of Berlin, short of positions that could have been reached. He understood what it meant when Soviet forces filled those spaces instead. And then there were the prisoners. Reports had been arriving, fragmented, incomplete, frustrating in their lack of detail, suggesting that American POWs liberated or captured in areas now falling under Soviet control were not being promptly returned. The machinery of prisoner exchange, which should have been straightforward, given that the war was ending, was moving slowly. Some names on expected lists did not match the men who appeared. Some men who should have been moving west toward American lines were not appearing at all. The exact scope of this problem was not clear in April 1945. But the outline was visible enough to disturb anyone paying close attention. Patton was paying close attention, and every order to slow down felt, to him, like a decision to let the outline become permanent. The tension between Patton and Eisenhower over the pace of advance was not a single argument. It was a sustained disagreement running through the final weeks of the European War, built from multiple orders, multiple frustrations, and multiple moments where the man on the ground and the man at the strategic level were looking at the same situation and reaching different conclusions. Eisenhower's position, when stripped of its diplomatic coating, came down to this: the war in Europe had to end in a way that preserved the alliance with the Soviet Union long enough to complete the defeat of Japan. The Pacific War was still ongoing. Soviet entry into the Pacific theater had been requested by American planners. Fracturing the relationship with Stalin over the final positions of Western forces in Germany was a price Washington was not willing to pay. This was not weakness. It was coalition mathematics, and Eisenhower was responsible for making those numbers work. But the mathematics looked different from where Patton was standing. What Patton saw, or believed he was beginning to see, was that the Soviets were not simply an allied power completing a shared objective. They were a competing power, extending their reach with every mile of territory their armies entered. Every day of Western hesitation was a day of Soviet consolidation. Every halt order served, however unintentionally, as a gift to a force that had very different plans for the post-war map. Whether Patton was right in every specific judgment is debatable. That he saw the emerging Soviet-Western tension earlier and more clearly than most of his peers is harder to dispute. The halt orders themselves were not always absolute. Patton found ways to interpret the limits of his instructions with characteristic flexibility, advancing in some directions while technically complying with restrictions in others. His known command style involved a fluid relationship with the boundary between permitted and prohibited movement. Accounts from officers who served under him suggest that he sometimes treated halt orders as opening positions in a negotiation rather than final conclusions. Eisenhower was not unaware of this. The exchanges between them, while not fully preserved in their private texture, were known to carry real heat. The deeper layer of the problem was what the halt orders foreclosed. American forces that stopped short of certain positions could not reach certain camps, certain towns, certain areas where prisoners, American, British, and others, were still being held or had recently been passed into Soviet control. The prisoner question was not separable from the advance question. They were the same question. And every mile of halted advance was a mile of reduced access to men who needed to be found. The surviving record is incomplete on precisely how many American prisoners were unaccounted for in Soviet-controlled territory during those weeks. The numbers debated by historians vary, and the full accounting was never satisfactorily completed. What is clear is that the problem was real, that it was being raised through command channels, and that it was not being resolved with the speed or transparency that Patton and others believed it demanded. When trucks went east to retrieve men and came back without the expected numbers, the explanation offered was rarely specific. The paperwork did not align. The men were not where the list said they should be. The Soviet authorities at various checkpoints were cooperative in tone and obstructive in practice. The silence was becoming evidence of something. The exact nature of that something remained, and in some ways remains, the hard question. The confrontation between Patton's instincts and Eisenhower's strategic framework reached its sharpest point not in a single dramatic moment, but in a series of collisions that accumulated into something larger than any one exchange. Patton, by late April and into May of 1945, was no longer simply a general chafing at tactical restrictions. He was a senior officer with serious concerns about what post-war Europe was going to look like, and those concerns were beginning to shape how he spoke, how he wrote, and how he thought about the meaning of the victory being assembled around him. His known correspondence from this period, letters to his wife Beatrice, and remarks recorded by staff officers, reveals a man who was not simply angry about halt orders. He was disturbed, in a deeper way, by what the political management of the war's end seemed to be producing. He used strong language about the Soviets. He used strong language about Washington. He said things that were, by any reasonable measure, professionally dangerous and politically incendiary. The exact words from specific private moments are not always preserved with certainty, but the general tenor is well documented enough to draw from without distortion. Patton did not believe that halting short of achievable objectives in the name of Soviet-American harmony was wisdom. He believed it was a mistake that would outlast the war itself. He said, in various forms, that the army capable of driving through Germany was the same army that could define the post-war reality of Europe, and that choosing not to use that leverage in the name of Allied politics was a decision that future generations would pay for. He was not quiet about this. He was not subtle. He was Patton. What made this particularly dangerous for him was the gap between his rank and his actual authority. Patton commanded the Third Army. He did not command Allied policy. His job, however much he resented it in those weeks, was to execute the orders that came down from Eisenhower and from Washington, not to substitute his own geopolitical judgment for theirs. When he failed to maintain that boundary, and accounts suggest he failed it frequently and loudly during this period, the institutional response was swift. He was managed. He was spoken to. He was warned, in the polite but unmistakable language of military hierarchy, that his views were not welcome outside authorized channels. The answer to his pressure, more than once, was no. And the men who gave that answer were not German officers. They were American ones. That fact did not escape Patton, and it did not make him easier to manage. Patton's warnings about Soviet intentions were not, as later history demonstrated, simply the product of an aggressive general's frustration with being slowed down. The post-war map of Europe validated, in painful detail, many of the concerns he had raised while they were still being dismissed as operational impatience or political naivety. The territories that Western forces halted short of became, in most cases, Soviet-dominated occupation zones that hardened into Soviet satellite states. The prisoner question. American and other Allied POWs who passed through Soviet-controlled areas at the end of the war remained unresolved for years, producing congressional inquiries, declassified studies, and historical arguments that continued long after the men involved had either returned home or were gone beyond any rescue. The exact accounting was never fully completed. What is established is that the mechanisms for returning liberated Western prisoners from Soviet-controlled territory functioned slowly, inconsistently, and in some cases, not at all, and that the political will to press the Soviets hard on this issue was limited by larger strategic calculations. Patton's reputation suffered in the final months of his life precisely because he would not stop saying what he believed was true. He was removed from command of the Third Army in October 1945, not for battlefield failure, but for comments made during a press conference in which he compared the Soviet Nazi distinction in ways that were politically catastrophic. He died in December 1945, weeks after a road accident in Germany, without having answered to the military or political establishment that had been managing his bluntness for years. Whether Patton was right in every specific claim is not the clean conclusion history offers. He was a complicated man with real limitations and real blind spots. What history does offer is this: The concerns he raised about the cost of Allied political concessions in the final weeks of the European war were not imaginary. They were early. What this story reveals is not simply a conflict between a general and his command structure. It reveals something about the nature of victory itself and the enormous pressure that surrounds the question of what victory is actually for. Wars end with announcements. The paperwork is signed. The broadcasts are made. The celebrations fill the streets. But the reality underneath those announcements is always more complicated, and the complications do not wait for the celebrations to finish. Patton understood, in his rough and often politically disastrous way, that the moment of apparent victory is also the moment of maximum vulnerability. Because it is the moment when attention shifts, when caution relaxes, when the question of what was actually being protected gets replaced by the relief that the shooting has stopped. He was not wrong to ask what was being traded away in the rush to finish the war cleanly. He was not wrong to resist the idea that a halt order issued in the name of coalition management was automatically the same thing as a decision that protected American interests. He was not wrong to press on the prisoner question when the answers coming back were incomplete. The fact that his pressing was often reckless, often politically destructive, and often damaging to his own position does not change the legitimacy of what he was pressing about. The last enemy of any war is not always the soldier still holding a gun. Sometimes it is the process by which powerful institutions decide which questions are too expensive to keep asking. Patton kept asking. That is, in the end, what made him impossible to fully silence and impossible to fully satisfy. Victory means little if the cost of declaring it is paid by the men who were never brought home.